So we're going to make our way through the higher specimen paper today, looking at how to answer all of the questions and hopefully giving you some hints and tips along the way. You'll find all the accompanying audio that you require to answer the questions on Google Classroom. And as you make your way through this video, it will tell you when to start and stop to go back to get that audio and be able to try the questions as we go. So looking at question 1, the question is telling us we're focusing on vocal music. It asks us to find 3 concepts in the excerpt it plays us from the list below. The first thing that I'm going to do while I'm waiting for the music to start is read through that list of concepts and A, work out what they mean, and B, work out are there any it's most likely or least likely to be. What I'd like you to do is go through and, for example, next to each one, give me a small definition. Interrupted cadence could be ends minor. While you do that, I'd like you to try and discount some. The first that jump out to me are concerto grosso. We know that concerto grosso is a concerto with a group of soloists from the Baroque period. That is not related to vocal music. Therefore, I can get rid of that. Similarly, sonata is a piece for solo piano or solo instrument with piano, which is not related to vocal music. Therefore, I'm going to get rid of that straight away. Now I'm going to look through the list of concepts for things that are related to vocal music. For example, melismatic, meaning that the word is spread out over several notes, or obbligato, meaning a solo instrument joins in with the singer. They could very likely be related to vocal music. I'm going to give you 2 seconds. No, I'm not. I'm going to give you a few seconds this now to go through and see if you could label all of the concepts. Now that I have some definitions, I've eliminated the concepts that I know are not going to be the correct answer and chosen some that I think are very likely to be the right answer. I'm going to listen to the piece of music and I'm going to pick 3 concepts that I can hear. Now that you've had the opportunity to try that question, before we move on to part B, the answers that you should have found were basso continuo, as you heard the kind of harpsichord bass line. You should have heard melismatic, as the male voice had several notes per word, and the obbligato joining in on the trumpet, that being the particularly prominent solo part that joined in with the singer. Moving on to part B, we hear a new piece of music played twice and are asked to find the style of the vocal music. Now, best practice for this question would be to give yourself a list of concepts beneath it of all the styles you can think of. You're focusing on vocal music, so you're not thinking of things like symphonies. You're thinking of anything to do with opera, oratorio, for example. The best way you're going to find them to revise is on the grid like this that you have on Google Classroom with all of the styles in the left-hand column. Right now, I'd like you to go through and highlight any that you think are related to vocal music and then consider them as you listen to this piece. There is a similar grid, as you know, for National 5, National 4, National 3, but the majority of the time when it is a one-word answer, you are going to be thinking of a higher level concept. So I would like you to consider these concepts first before you think of National 5 or National 4 level answers. You can see the correct answer for this was recitative. You heard a kind of sung speech where there wasn't a huge amount of accompaniment, there wasn't a particularly fancy vocal line. A lot of it was more spoken than sung. You can see on the right hand side of the SQA guidance, no other answers were accepted, only recitative. Moving on to question 2. This is the one where we hear one piece of music and a voice that guides us through as we listen. What I'd like you to do every time you attempt a question 2 is to go through and try and make this multiple choice. In one question, you're being asked to find 5 answers. So you need to make that easier for yourself. Best practice, I would say, is to write down the side of your page as you do that. I'm going to do this now. I would recommend that to use this video properly, you pause and you try and do that yourself before we start. I'm going to rub out the scribbles that I have so beautifully done. An ornament. What are our options for ornament? You could have mordant, trill, aciacatura, and you can write them in shorthand down the side. The examiner will not mark any of this. They will only look at what you write in this box here. So you can write yourself as many notes as you like. The rhythmic feature. Referring back to your grid where you have all of your concepts organised, this would be things like triplet, 3 against 2, syncopation, augmentation, diminution. The instrument playing the melody is, that could be any instrument at all. The bass line outlines a descending something scale. You could have major, you could have minor, you could have whole tone, you could have chromatic. You need to consider that this is higher, and the majority of the time you are going to have a higher level concept here. So I would focus your attention on these two. One other thing to keep in mind is if it's minor, you would want to specify if that was harmonic minor or melodic minor. Remember, this is not a strictly professional way of remembering them. The harmonic minor sounds most like your snake charmer, whereas the melodic one, in class we would say, oh, is that minor? Is that major? Which one? That's how we normally recognise it. So I'll draw a question mark. That's how I would approach that. You need to find your way of remembering and how you're going to write that down. The instrumental group performing the excerpt is, well, that's when you're going to refer back to your wonderful grid that you have and consider which instrumental groups you have learned about, which instrumental groups you expect to hear. Obviously, a good bit of exam technique is to think of, hypothetically, if you have the instrument playing the melody as a trumpet, what instrumental group would that belong to? That's normally going to steer you in the right direction. If you identify it as a string quartet, for example, obviously the instrument playing the melody is going to have to belong to that group. A bit of common sense applies. So looking at the answers for question 2, the SQA are very clear that for question 1, they would accept mordant. Question 2 is slightly trickier. They would accept syncopation, as that is the correct answer. However, on this occasion, they would allow you to answer off the beat or ostinato and still get the mark. Question 3, the solo instrument was a cello. The scale was chromatic, and the instrumental group was a string quartet. The one there that I think is going to have tripped you up the most is the chromatic scale. How do you identify that it's a chromatic scale rather than whole tone? Well, whole tone sounds really dreamy. Chromatic, they're using all of the semitones, so it's coming down tiny little steps at a time. The only reason I highlight that is I know that the majority of you will probably have tripped yourself up by putting whole tone scale, as that's the one that we know and enjoy the most. Moving into question 3, this time we have music from a whole range of different styles. That means that we need to be thinking about everything we've learned and not just focusing in on one thing. Part A asks you to listen to the excerpt and tick only one box to describe what you hear. Again, feel free to make any notes that you like down the side of the page that are going to help you to identify these concepts. These 4 are all higher level and can be difficult to identify, so make that easier for yourself. Augmentation, we know, is when the notes are doubled, so it sounds like it's getting slower. Interrupted cadence, we know, finishes on a minor chord. Passacaglia are variations over a ground bass, so I would maybe be writing ground bass to remind myself. And mode obviously means that there is a mode used in it. Maybe I'm going to write modal to remind myself that it's going to sound not major or not minor. Maybe I'll pop that in brackets just to remind me as I listen. Continuing with question 3, part 2 is quite tricky. It asks us to name the harmonic concept used at the final cadence. Harmonic concepts can be found on our grid under melody or harmony, but it's important that you know which ones are melody and which ones are harmony. The first thing that I'm going to think about and try to jot down in the exam, if I were you, was what are my cadences? Remind yourself. You've got perfect, you've got imperfect, you've got plagal, and you've got interrupted. What other harmonic words do you know that could happen at a cadence? There's another cadence that we know that we learned about in the Brock period. That is a tierce de Picardy. I'm using shorthand here as I know you can hear my voice and I'm running out of space. The other harmonic concept that could very potentially happen at a final cadence is a modulation. Now, given that that is a National 5 concept and that you could use a cadence to do that, I'm going to ignore modulation and focus on these other 5. As a reminder, perfect sounds completely finished. Normally in class, we talk about imperfect sounding like it's maybe halfway through and has left us on chord 5. Plagal sounds finished, but it's just a little bit weaker. It goes from chord 4 to chord 1. And interrupted finishes on a minor chord. Tierce de Picardy, remember, happened in the Brock period when a piece was minor all the way through and then finishes on a nice major chord. Good luck with part 2 and then we'll do the answers. Looking at the answers then for the first part of question 3, we should have Passacaglia for part 1, as we had variations being played over a ground bass. The bass line just kept repeating over and over again. And then part 2, we had Tierce de Picardy, as we had a piece of music that was minor all the way through and then finished on a lovely, bright, happy major chord. Continuing with question 3, we're now on to B. We're being asked to listen to the following excerpt and name the playing technique used by the guitar. It's also telling us that this is an Italian term. We're then being asked to listen to a different excerpt and name the playing technique used by the guitar. So you could use all of your space down the side to identify any different kind of techniques that you could use on the guitar. For me, there's only 2 things that are coming to mind that could be potential answers. The first that's jumping out would be tremolando, as we shake the strings as we play or tremble them, or it could be harmonics, which we know is where we kind of tap the strings. I'm going to let you listen to the 2 excerpts and see if you can get those 2 techniques the correct way round before you move on to part C, where you're being asked to describe the time signature. Now, very clearly, it's asking you to name the concept which describes the time signature. It is not asking you to name the time signature. Therefore, you don't need to say this is in 4/4, 2/4, 6/8. It's asking you, is it simple? Is it compound? Is it irregular? Or are there time changes? Does it change throughout? I'll leave you with the audio to complete all of those 3 questions. So here are the answers for part B. B, part 1, we had tremolando. Part 2, we had harmonics. And then question C, we had irregular time signatures. You would also get a point if you just said irregular. And interestingly, they would on this occasion accept it if you named the time signature as 5/4. Personally, I would recommend that you just label it as irregular time signatures Because if you get it wrong, maybe you put 7/4, or maybe you identify, one beat out, you're not going to get the mark. So if you can identify that it's not quite right, it's not quite 4/4, 3/4, 6/8, something that you would be able to clearly state, I would play it safe, I would put irregular, as that is going to guarantee you a mark. Moving on to question 5, it's very, very similar to our opening question. It's important that you read the question though, as this time we're being asked for 4 concepts rather than 3, giving us a potential 4 marks for the question. Similar to before, I think it's important that you go through and you look at what is it likely to be versus what is it very unlikely to be. The question clearly states that we're looking for instrumental music. So I would go through your concepts and A, give a definition for each, and B, get rid of any that are strictly vocal music rather than instrumental. I would recommend that you pause this now and try and write some of your own definitions while I write some shorthand for each one. You could come back and check that yours are correct. For concertino, I would have something along the lines of the fact that that is muted. Augmentation, as we said before, are when the note values double, so it sounds like it's slowing down. Classical, obviously meaning that it's from the classical period. Key things that you might listen for are the size of the orchestra. Is there a piano, for example? Diminished seventh, we normally describe in class as being a scary sounding chord. How could I do that with a smiley face? Could that be scary rather than sad? Alberti bass, we know, is played on the piano and is a broken chord. Concertino is the small group of soloists. Rubato means slowing down and speeding up. I'm not using great shorthand here. I should be using less words. Contrary motion, one part is going up while one part is coming down. Obbligato, a solo instrument. A solo instrument joining in. And 3 against 2, when we have triplets, my screen, when we have triplets playing on top of quavers. So it doesn't quite align. Now, I think it's important that you don't just stop there. You do have a lot of time before the question starts. So I think it's important now that you go through and you think about, okay, if it is an Alberti bass, what is it likely to be paired with, or what is it not likely to be paired with? Now that you've had a chance to complete that question, here are the approved answers that you would have been awarded if this was your paper. We had diminished seventh, as we had a kind of scary sounding chord. We had contrary motion, as one part went up and the other came down. We had 3 against 2, sounding like cross rhythms. And the tempo did fluctuate through the use of rubato. There was parts that were speeding up, while parts then slowed down. It wasn't a very, very strict time. Moving on to question 6. This question has the potential to earn you a full 6 marks. It's very important that you develop good technique when you're answering this question to make sure that you maximise getting all 6 marks. As a reminder, you'd think I'd be better at marking these up now. As a reminder, you can get a maximum of 2 marks per box. So even if you write 6 correct things for that first box, you can only get a maximum of 2. However, there is no limit to what you can write. So if I were you, I would be aiming to write as many correct things for each box as possible to ensure that you get your full 2 marks. If you write 4 or 5 things, you can afford for 2 of them to be wrong and still achieve your full 2 marks for that box. What we'll do is, what we have already done and will continue to build on, is a list of questions for each potential heading that would help you get full marks. For example, the first box is asking you about melody and harmony. So one of the first things I would ask you are there any ornaments? Are there any scales? Is it a pedal or an inverted pedal? Can you hear any cadences? What is the tonality of the piece? That means, is it minor? Is it major? Is it modal? Is it atonal? Is there anything particular about the melody? Like, is there an additional counter melody? That you could comment on. Texture is much more straightforward. Texture, we're thinking, is it homophonic? Is it polyphonic? Or at higher, we learnt about the word contrapuntal, which is very similar to polyphonic, with lots of parts moving in and out of each other. For timbre, we're obviously thinking about any instrument at all that you hear, instrument, and how it's played. So if we hear string instruments, are they arco? Are they pizzicato? Are they tremolando? If we hear brass, is it being played muted or consordino? If there are particular dynamics, is it piano, nice and quiet, or is it forte and bold and loud? Is it a crescendo? Is it a diminuendo? That would all be included in this box. I'd like to take some time to consider those questions, make sure you understand exactly what you're listening for, and then continue the video. So this is the answer scheme for question 6. This does not mean that there are not other concepts. You may have heard other things that, yes, were there. However, you were asked to find the most prominent, and these are the concepts that have been agreed are the most prominent. The only thing you need to be aware of is that you cannot write every single concept that you know. For example, in melody and harmony, if you wrote major, minor, atonal, modal, the SQA would be able to clearly see that you were just reciting the entire concept list. Please now mark what you have done, and remember you can get a maximum of 2 points for each heading. So now that we have reached question 7, I know that you all just absolutely love this question, but I really would encourage you to still try it. We have a number of concepts down the left-hand side of the screen, and you need to find 5 that exist in both excerpt A and excerpt B. The first excerpt that you listen to, you are only going to tick concepts in this box here. The second excerpt that you listen to, you're only going to tick boxes in this column here, which should hopefully leave you with 5 common to both. Remember, you will only get marks for anything that you tick in column C. Column A and B will completely be ignored. Similar to last time, I would ensure that you write down lots of definitions. As a marker, I really enjoy when I see that people have written in this box, for example, interrupted cadence, they've written finishes minor, and they have given themselves little hints and tips the whole way through. That makes it so much easier to concentrate and so much easier to identify. I think you should pause this video just now and try and write your own definitions for what you think these things mean, and then I'll give you a little hint for each one when you resume the video. If you're now resuming, I would say your hints and tips that would be useful for you to write down are interrupted cadence finishes minor, tierce to picardy is minor the whole way through and then finishes on a major chord. Trill is your 2 notes, swap in really, really quickly, a little ornament. In class, we describe a dominant seventh as sounding strong or leaning onto the next note. I would love to be able to draw a little muscle, but as you can tell, my Apple Pencil skills are limited. Augmentation, that's come up again. That's one for us to keep thinking about. It's when all the notes are doubled, so it sounds like it's slowing down. Anacrusis, one that we often forget, but does go all the way back to National 5, is when it starts before the first beat of the bar. Rubato, we've just had either speeding up and slowing down, a lot of movement and tempo throughout the piece. Triplets, when we've got things grouped in threes and we can say things like Jennifer or strawberry or elephant along with the piece of music to fit that rhythm. Concerto, where we have one soloist playing along with the orchestra. Sonata for solo piano or solo instrument accompanied by piano. String quartet, when we have our 4 string instruments, 2 violins, a viola and a cello. And then finally, concertino, when we have our small group of soloists. Arco, when we're playing with the bow. Or tremolando, when we are shaking the bow. Again, similar to questions before, it's important that you consider which things could go with each other. Hypothetically, if you have ticked in column A that the answer is concerto, it could not also be a sonata. Something cannot be a soloist with the orchestra as well as being a solo piano. It would be one. Having listened to both excerpts now, you should find that the 5 you have common to both are trill, dominant seventh, triplet, anacrusis, and sonata. You should have other ticks in column A and other ticks in column B, but these are the only 5 that should exist in both. Now moving on to our final question. You can normally rely on this question for giving you a good tune, or in my perfect world, hopefully something from a musical. This time you have got a piece from Les Mis and you're being asked to find the concepts at the top. An imperfect cadence, an inverted pedal, the first entry of an oboe, a perfect cadence in the major key, and the first example of an octave leap in the vocal part. You just need to simplify these. Sometimes that can seem more scary than it is. A perfect cadence in the major key, for example, is the same as any other perfect cadence that you will hear. That implies to me that at some point it's going to change key and become minor. So you just need to find the perfect cadence while it's still major. The first example of an octave leap in the vocal part, that just means an octave leap when they're singing. And it needs to be the first time that it happens. I would pay particular attention to if it's asking you the first time that something has happened or if it will accept it any time. For example, in this question, there are 2 imperfect cadences and you will get the mark for finding either of them. The oboe, however, it's clearly asking for the first time that you hear the oboe. So there is only one place that you will get that mark. Again, just like every other question, I would go through and I would make sure that you know exactly what these mean. And if you need to write a definition next to them, please do. I'll do that with you this now, or you could pause the video and write your own definitions and use mine to check you are correct. Starting with an imperfect cadence. An imperfect cadence sounds unfinished. In class, we quite often say that it sounds like it's halfway through or they're taking a breath. Inverted pedal is a long held high note above everything else. An oboe, I don't want to offend anyone that might be watching this video, but an oboe to some people might sound squeaky. When I was at school, I was told it sounds like a duck. A perfect cadence in the major key. A perfect cadence sounds finished, like we've reached the end of a phrase, it's been resolved. And the first example of an octave leap in the vocal part. An octave leap, remember, meaning that we've moved from, say, low C to high C. Now that you have a definition for each one, you simply have to listen to the music and insert each of the underlined words into the box that it happens. As a reminder, you can only put things in once. For example, even though there are 2 imperfect cadences, you can only put it in one time, but you can have more than one thing in a box. For example, 2 things could potentially happen in box 7, and you could still get full marks for that. Good luck. Here are the answers that you should expect to find for question 8. You'll notice that imperfect cadence could be in either box 5 or 14. However, just as a final reminder, you would only get it in one place. If you were to put it in both, you would risk losing marks.